distinguished representatives of the Ministry of Culture of Jalisco, distinguished representatives of UNESCO, my former UN colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you greetings from the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, and especially our Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program. Following an established protocol that we have built over years internationally and at the UN, of course, I would like to recognize the indigenous peoples of this land, the Huicholes and the Nahuas, the traditional owners of this territory, where this important conference is taking place. Mexico has been linked with many groundbreaking international initiatives for new international standards and actions, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I have visited this beautiful and culturally rich country several times on official mission since the year 2000, and I was recently there in 2019 for a symposium on indigenous autonomies. Latin America is the foremost part of the world where new ideas are fermenting, largely due to the dynamic interface between states and indigenous peoples' movements. Latin America produces innovative thinking because of its tremendous cultural diversity. It is no wonder that some 15 countries have established intercultural bilingual education, for example, that several constitutions have recognized indigenous languages and the pluricultural nature of the state, and that interculturality is a concept that countries in Latin America are exploring as the paradigm for a new society, and a concept that becomes especially precious in these times of crisis. This past month, I received the following email from my late son's music teacher, who has a school of electronic music production in New York. Quote, "Things are getting really scary. Not sure how long we can hold up the business. However, we have some great applications for the scholarship. We have established a music scholarship in the name of my son, Andreas Robbins. One student I already accepted and have been teaching. She's the top woman rapper right now in her country. And now we have a second applicant that I think would be great, who is a Haitian music producer that has a school in Haiti, and he would like me to teach him and help him develop more contemporary courses for kids in Haiti. We aren't getting any paying students any longer due to COVID. This is getting really scary. Not sure what's coming next," unquote. This message made me wonder how many music schools will be obliged to close down because of the pandemic. How many musicians and other artists will stay in their profession despite lack of income due to COVID? How many young people will be deprived of music and art classes at school because of this economic crisis, as was announced, for example, in my country, Greece? Are we going to lose a generation of people whose work is devoted to culture? At the same time, I felt hopeful because many people who serve the arts continue, despite all odds, to be faithful to their passion of creating. They seek 1,000 new ways to survive, to create, and to share their creativity with all of us. In times of calamity, like during the present pandemic, we as individuals and as societies need culture most to surround us, to ground us, to connect us, to strengthen us, to uplift us, to unleash our creative potential that will help us dream and imagine the time after COVID with different and better societies. It is these human aspects of culture that cultural rights help us address. During these times of lockdown, quarantine, illness, loss of loved ones, or unemployment and limited social life, how much we have appreciated listening to music, getting movies or plays offered to us through TV or the internet, cooking special foods and rediscovering family recipes, listening to stories of our elders, reading books, continuing to learn as students through the internet, relearning wisdoms of our community's traditional knowledge, such as herbs and traditional medicine, or reaching out to systems of spirituality that help sustain us. through online commerce, we have also enjoyed continuing offerings of cultural goods during these times. Because culture is understood in a very broad sense. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights was inspired by UNESCO's work on the concept of culture, which itself follows the anthropological understanding of culture. In its general comment on Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights regarding the right to participate in cultural life, the committee provided the following understanding of culture, quote, "Culture is a broad, inclusive concept encompassing all manifestations of human existence. The expression cultural life is an explicit reference to culture as a living process, historical, dynamic, and evolving, with a past, a present, and a future. The concept of culture must be seen not as a series of isolated manifestations or hermetic compartments, but as an interactive process whereby individuals and communities, while preserving their specificities and purposes, give expression to the culture of humanity. This concept takes account of the individuality and otherness of culture as the creation and product of society. Culture, for the purposes of Article 15, encompasses, inter alia, ways of life, language, oral and written literature, music and song, non-verbal communication, religion or belief systems, rites and ceremonies, sport and games, methods of production or technology, natural and man-made environments, food, clothing, and shelter, and the arts, customs, and traditions through which individuals, groups of individuals, and communities express their humanity and the meaning they give to their existence and build their worldview, representing their encounter with the external forces affecting their lives," unquote. When we speak about cultural rights as human rights, we speak about human dignity. So we elevate cultural rights to a public protectable good, a matter of public interest that invokes the responsibility and accountability of the state under international law, a matter of law and policy, an area that requires respect, protection, fulfillment, and remedies by the state. In other words, cultural rights require responsible state attention and action. They cannot be left just to the forces of the market, for example. Cultural rights are both individual and collective or group rights. 5 human rights are understood as cultural rights under international law. 1, the right to education. 2, the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. 3, the right to benefit from the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which the person is the author. And 4, the freedom of scientific research and creative activity. And lastly, the right to participate in cultural life, which is the most all-encompassing of these rights. 6 normative elements underlie cultural rights. 1, non-discrimination and equality. 2, freedom to create and contribute to culture. 3, freedom to choose in which cultures and cultural life to participate. 4, freedom of dissemination. 5, freedom to cooperate internationally. And 6, the right to participate in the definition, preparation, and implementation of policies on culture. Due to time constraints, I cannot refer in any detail to the above elements, but in this introduction, I would like to approach cultural rights with 2 main lenses that may provide more clarity on the topic of this conference. 1, the first lens, is to look at cultural rights as both individual rights and collective rights, and to focus on the creators of culture, both the persons and whole communities. We examine the process of cultural expression, participation, and production, and ask human rights questions such as, are people free to express their cultures and to create? Are individuals or communities discriminated against in this process? Are they protected from non-state actors? Are there laws, policies, and budgets that will promote participation in cultural life, for instance, through formal and non-formal education, access to museums for persons with disabilities, or access to publishing houses for women authors, or access to mother tongue education for indigenous children? In the case of collective cultural rights, we follow a system-oriented understanding of culture, where the individual is seen as a product of a cultural system. So here, from a human rights standpoint, we have to focus on protecting that system, the community, the human group that creates culture. This is the case specifically for indigenous peoples and for national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, as well as for migrants. Here, some of the then the second lens is to look at culture from a material point of view, as a product of an individual creator, or as an accumulated material heritage of particular human groups, including but not limited to monuments and artifacts. It also includes intangible cultural heritage, such as music, design, dance, etc. Here, some of the human rights questions are: how are the products of cultural expressions of groups or persons protected? How are they linked to their creators? Are the creators enjoying the moral and material benefits of their cultural expressions? Is the very existence of the group protected that produces the culture? Already in 1948, in the famous Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27, we read that everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author, unquote. This provision means that states have recognized the human rights dimension, namely the human dignity dimension of protecting the creators of culture, and that this is not just a matter of commerce. When it comes to indigenous peoples, we find the boldest recognition of cultural rights in contemporary international law in the historic UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007. No fewer than 17 of its 46 articles refer to cultural rights. This is a body of law that can actually inform and enrich many parts of our societies, not only indigenous peoples. Regarding specifically the protection of the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples, we have very clear and extensive provisions in Article 31 of the Declaration, and I quote it here because it's quite relevant to our conference. Quote, indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of flora and fauna, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, and protect and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. States shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights, unquote. Coming to intellectual property regimes, they occupy today more and more areas of human cultural production. Yet, there are still unresolved aspects from a human rights point of view regarding protection of traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources of indigenous peoples and local communities. These issues are being fervently debated for 20 years at WIPO's Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Folklore. Some states, especially from the north, are placing impediments and resistance in completing this task. Given the tremendous economic interests involved in traditional knowledge, not least in the pharmaceutical industry, it is no coincidence that there are at least 15 intergovernmental organizations that deal with traditional knowledge today. UNESCO's 2001 Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, its 2003 Convention on the Protection of Tangible and Intangible Cultural Heritage, and the 2005 Convention on the Promotion and Protection of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions certainly provide a rich framework for the protection of cultural expressions or products. The cultural sector now accounts for 6.1% of the global economy, generating nearly 30 million jobs worldwide, employing more people aged 15 to 29 than any other sector. The cultural and creative industries have become essential for inclusive economic growth, reducing inequalities, and helping achieve the sustainable development goals of 2030. Coming back to cultural rights as human rights, we note a paradox that despite their importance in the lives of people, cultural rights have faced neglect for a long time. We could say that cultural rights as part of human rights have been to a large extent the soft underbelly or the weak link of the human rights regime developed after the Second World War. While we depend on culture in order to live, as we depend on oxygen in order to live, we see the tremendous challenges to cultural rights that often go unnoticed and are unattended by the public sector, by the state. They are often not seen as human rights at all. I would like to take a couple of minutes to speak about why have cultural rights been generally neglected, and let me mention just 3 of several points on this. One difficulty lies in the definition of cultural rights, because it's tied to the concept of culture, which is fluid and changing. The prevalent understanding of culture that I referred to earlier was viewed for a long time as too difficult to base actual rights and formal state obligations on. The challenge of grappling with the definition of cultural rights partially prevented promotion of these rights by international human rights system for a long time. Second, cultural rights have been considered by some as a luxury, as something that comes after bread and water and health, as an item only for societies at a certain stage of development. This misconception is a danger, especially in times such as this pandemic, because we know that culture represents the soul, the moral edifice, the self-definition and self-esteem of a person or a community, without which life loses context and meaning. And third, one of the most significant difficulties in dealing with cultural rights is that they have evoked for governments the fear of group identities and group rights that the state feels threatened by. What are some challenges to cultural rights under the pandemic? Cultural rights boldly reveal the intercomplementarity, interdependence, and interrelatedness of all human rights, civil, economic, political, and social. The realities and special challenges of other areas of human rights due to COVID have deep implications for cultural rights. We know from history that cultures have produced some of their highest expressions during times of economic prosperity, from the golden century of my native city, Athens, to the 5th century BC, in the 5th century BC, to the Mali Empire in the 13th century, to the Inca Empire in the 15th century. Many cultures have demonstrated that. In modern times and cities such as New York, the arts survive thanks to private or public financial support, even in normal times when we don't have an economic crisis. We know, in other words, that economic and other support for the creators of cultural products is crucial. And in times of pandemic and economic crisis, such support is needed even more. The impact of economic and social systemic inequalities, in short, the impact of discrimination on cultural rights, becomes quite visible during the pandemic. For example, in the case of the right to education, where students now depend enormously on learning online and where the digital divide excludes poorer communities or households from the right to education, a paramount cultural right. The unequal access to healthcare for indigenous peoples, minorities, migrants, and other marginalized communities takes a heavy and disproportionate toll on them, including the loss of elders at an alarming pace. Communities thus lose languages, fundamental traditional knowledge for their communities, and the possibility of intergenerational cultural transmission. Culturally appropriate healthcare, an element required under human rights law, a principle of non-discrimination, is curtailed during the pandemic. For example, we know that many indigenous peoples or migrant communities don't have access to COVID-related information in their languages, as reported this month by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Mr. Francisco Cali Tsai Maya Cachiquel from Guatemala. Disaggregated data are lacking in many countries that would reveal these inequalities and clarify the targeted actions needed. The exploitation of the pandemic by authoritarian regimes has led to a shrinking civic space in our society, with serious limitations for freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, including critical cultural expressions. The pandemic has also given the excuse to some governments to threaten the very existence of whole cultures, for example, of whole indigenous communities, by allowing the aggressive influx and operation of extractive corporations, land grabbing and exploitation, while populations are kept under lockdown. The closing of borders due to COVID in many instances hinders a fundamental element of cultural rights, the freedom to cooperate internationally on cultural matters, which is extremely important for the flourishing of cultural rights, and which initiatives such as our conference are meant to encourage. The freedom and opportunity for creative activity is severely curtailed also due to the pandemic, also because of limitations of the freedom of movement and lack of access to places of cultural display, physical or virtual. Scientific freedom, which is part of the right to participate in cultural life, is also challenged in some instances during this pandemic, where political and economic expedience leads to the silencing or distortion of certain scientific voices. Lastly, in the midst of this economic crisis of the pandemic, culture creators and the culture sector are often forgotten or excluded from special support measures by the state. And from what we hear, they are rarely consulted to adequately participate in solutions. Now, despite these challenges, there have been some encouraging examples. There have been creative initiatives by collectives of actors, musicians, poets, or dancers to organize performances via the internet or in the open air with proper social distancing. Solidarity to threatened communities has flourished, as for instance, for indigenous peoples in Brazil, many of whom are facing an existential threat. Fundraisers and other events have been organized online. In Mexico, the National Institution for Indigenous Peoples supported the establishment of a national network of traditional healers acting as intermediaries to broadcast prevention messages on COVID. In Argentina and Paraguay, the governments broadcast messages related to COVID in indigenous languages via a radio station that reaches remote communities and via WhatsApp. In India, village councils and elders, including indigenous women, translated and helped disseminate information on COVID in indigenous languages. Dipping into their cultural knowledge, indigenous peoples have mobilized themselves actively in various ways, including self-isolation, health and hygiene initiatives, community care, self-subsistence activities, and documenting the situation and planning solutions. Indigenous cultural knowledge, such as traditional medicine and deep knowledge of local biodiversity and pharmacopoeia, including anti-inflammatory or antipyretic plants, coupled with indigenous holistic concepts of health, are important resources for indigenous peoples to maintain their well-being. Recognizing the importance of and mobilizing resilience in our cultures is very crucial in times of COVID. A study about indigenous communalism highlights that, quote, the benefits of group life to health are unmistakable, and community membership, if mobilized in health-promoting ways, is linked to reduced community prevalence of disease. A conclusion and some reflections for ways forward. Taking a holistic approach to cultural rights gives plenty of constructive policy responses to governments, even in times of the pandemic crisis. In today's interconnected world of greater expectations for democracy and of rising cultural identities, avoiding the respect for cultural rights can only lead to frustration in society, to lack of cohesion, and to conflict. I believe that in this critical crossroads of our world, respect for cultural freedom and pluralism within a context of a democratic polity is more urgent than ever. To recognize cultural rights as legal rights is a bold statement, a key to state action. Solutions are visible and require collaboration at local, national, and international level. Some ideas. 1. Cultural expressions within and across cultures and genuine intercultural exchanges and contacts will contribute to social cohesion that may suffer in times of calamity such as these, as people try to save themselves and their own. Xenophobia and racism may be curbed by people-to-people contacts through culture. The state has a role to play in facilitating a fertile ground for this to happen. 2. Humanitarian assistance such as food and healthcare must be culturally accessible and relevant at all times, including during these times of COVID. 3. Human rights-based approach requires the active participation of the cultural sector, such as associations of cultural professionals, including the academic associations, because academic freedom is crucial in raising critical voices in these times. 4. In order to ensure timely and culturally appropriate responses by states with regard to a pandemic or any other crisis, indigenous peoples must be direct participants. 5. When it comes to any actions that impact indigenous peoples' cultural heritage, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples requires their free, prior, and informed consent. This means that the state, through its laws and policies, has to protect this right of indigenous peoples, and that the cultural economic sector has to respect it as well. 6. Economic deprivation exacerbated by the pandemic should not lead to exploitation by cultural sector industries, either at individual level or at community level. 7. Socioeconomic data have to be disaggregated in these difficult times in order to reveal the true situation of marginalized sectors and clarify targeted interventions. 8. On a most immediate basis, the cultural professionals that have been hard hit because of the pandemic, artists, artisans, and other cultural producers, as well as cultural institutions, must be supported so that we do not find ourselves with a generation gap. 8. When it comes to indigenous peoples, it is the obligation of states under international law to abstain from any harmful policies that will affect their ways of life or threaten their very existence, especially through their displacement from their lands. 9, support of the intergenerational transmission or traditional knowledge and social structures of indigenous peoples must remain a priority for the cultural survival of indigenous peoples after the crisis, as is stressed by the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. 10th, given the fact that a lot of cultural expressions and products will be exchanged, promoted, or sold via the internet for the duration of the pandemic, creative ways must be found to keep those alive by bridging the digital divide between and within countries and accelerating connectivity for the benefit of all. In closing, this moment of crisis is one where we seek in each of our cultures the values of resilience, hope, and solidarity. As Karima Benoun said, she is the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights. She said this past July, quote, "Even in these trying times when more than 500,000 people have died from the virus, cultural rights are not a luxury. They are key to the overall implementation of universal human rights and a crucial part of the responses to many current challenges, from discrimination and poverty to COVID-19 itself. Moreover, the safeguarding and promotion of culture contributes directly to many of the Sustainable Development Goals," unquote. And the last word goes to a major culture creator and representative of this continent, the Yanomami leader, Davi Kopenawa. The continuing critical situation of the Yanomami epitomizes our discussion of the need to preserve cultural rights by also protecting the communities that create the cultures. In 2013, Davi and Bruce Albert published the book called The Falling Sky, where I read these words of Davi, quote, "After they, the white people, have understood my account, my story, I would like the white people to tell themselves, the Yanomami are other people than us, yet their words are right and clear. Now we understand what they think. These are words of truth. Their forest is beautiful and silent. They have lived in it without worry since the beginning of time. Their thought follows another path than that of merchandise. They want to live their way," unquote. Thank you, and I wish every success to this conference.